Right. Welcome, everyone, to today's kickoff program for difficult conversations on identity, race, and politics. We have our great panel here, the authors of this book, here to talk to you today about these important issues and to give you a good solid overview on some of the core concepts related to today's program.
Just when you pitched the ideal, I just thought it was phenomenal because I see a lack of civility within our society in regards to we can agree to disagree, but people are so vile sometimes right now when it comes to like political discourse, when it comes to the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, when it comes to women's rights, and we have people dictating what we can do with our bodies that don't have the same organs as us. And that is just so problematic to me. I live in the state of Florida, where right now we have a academic curriculum that is pushing the notion that African Americans or Africans who were enslaved were provided a skill set. And the reality is that in Africa, the pyramids were built, astronomy, mathematics, like very advanced people. And we hear conversations, well, Africans sold other Africans. And I'm like, yeah, that's true. They were other tribes like the Romans and the Greeks, and just getting people to understand. Because like when I look at, like the Black Lives Matter movement, I'll hear people say, well, all lives matter, or Black people kill Black people, and recognizing people don't understand that crime is intraracial, that white people kill white people, Asian people kill Asian people. It's more geographically based. And so I was just really interested in engaging in that kind of conversation and breaking down like what race is as a social construct, how it's not even biologically real, getting people to understand cancel culture, which is a way for the minority community to actually have some play and some say in the media outlet, because the media is controlled by like three big corporations who are dictating what's out there, and recognizing like those units of socialization and just how that factors into the biases that we have, and how we continue to have this big divide based on a social construct of race, where I really think it is more of a class-based issue. And we have like the top 3% manipulating everything and have us like kind of going at it. So we're not paying attention to what's happening in the left hand. So I was just really excited to be a part of this program and just to be able to talk about truthfully the difference I see in the political climate, and just how people we're not being civil with one another. And that's really an important part when we talk about emotional intelligence, that self-awareness and all that, which we're going to discuss. And I just think it's really important to be able to have those critical conversations, walk away, use our critical thinking skills, and engage with others that maybe we don't have the same political ideology or the same ethnicity or sexual orientation, but we can begin to have the dialogue and begin to understand one another. And I just think that's a really important part of the book and the activities in the back. So we talk about equity, like putting ourselves in someone else's shoes and looking at it from their vantage point. Because one of the things that's very interesting to me in America, and we lived in Germany for a long time, is the individualism as well as meritocracy. And it's just like, yeah, is it merit based? Because we've had people, to include women, locked out of systems for a long time. And so I just think the book helps dismantle a lot of the rhetoric that we have seen via the political machine, the media, and a variety of venues. So I think that we really do a good job deconstructing a lot of those areas where we can get people to engage in the conversation after each chapter.
Tammy, I love what you said about the whole concept of deconstructing the socialization that's been created by media and media outlets. And we know from our conversations around implicit bias that implicit bias can be described as blind spots, unintended people preferences formed through the socialization process, right? And this socialization really acts as a social filter in which we make judgments around about the people around us, and we're not even aware of it. So for me, in the work that I do with CPS and with all of you working all across the country, it was an eye opener that when you're on the ground when you're in the ground in Texas, in Colorado, on the ground in California, candidly, right? That what I have found is that despite what the media is saying, there's a real hunger, a thirst, a desire to really know what what is this thing all about? When we say DEI, DEIB, belonging, A, accessibility, what does that mean? And never before have I seen this earnest hunger, desire to really want to do the right thing. Again, I'm in the local government space in all of the jurisdictions I mentioned. I'm in the public education space. I'm in the state agency practice. And when you remove the political rhetoric, when you remove the media bylines, no matter where you're getting your source from, I find folks really want to know the truth. They really want a tool set. They really want to know guiding principles to support them in navigating this journey. And that's what I love about the book, because it gives. I wish I had this book when I was an education administrator in K-12. I wish I had this book as a seventh grade teacher, because again, in the community that I taught in, where you had these three very powerfully represented racial distinct, you had Native Americans, you had African Americans, and you had white, in the rural South, right? And not being able to unpack the reality of the lived experience from the mythology that we were taught. And I use mythology unapologetically, because I think in our educational system today, for those of us who were cultured and educated in the United States, we were taught mythology. I learned real history from my grandmother, who actually was an African American teacher, middle school in New York City. She gave me the flashcards, and that's when I learned about L'Enfant, and that's when I learned about, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, and I learned about all of those thought leaders who've been a part of our culture for generations, right? And so folks need a way to separate fact from fiction. Poppy and no, Brian's Poppy, and Tammy, we remember that commercial. Is it live or is it Memorex? And so I think the book is that wonderful tool, right? It's like, no, this is live, this is real. No, that's make believe, that's mythology. And I think practitioners, educators, students, parents really need this framework, this toolkit to really support them, so that they can make their own decisions that are going to benefit them. I mean, again, it goes back to what Tammy was saying about, the audacity of having one group of people tell another group of people what they should do with their own bodies. Well, we do that in the education space about telling folks how to think, what to believe. And so I think this book is just a wonderful opportunity for everyone to engage wherever you are in the educational spectrum, to really find that truth, celebrate that lived experience, right? Not about shame and blame, not about judgment, but it's about the reality, so that we can all grow together. Because it's like former President Barack Obama said, if we don't get it right together, then we're going to suffer the consequences together. And so this really is a call to action. It's our opportunity that we all get to grow. Again, let's do it together. So that's what I loved about the book project, and that's what I love about the product that we have created. It's a wonderful skill set. I wish I had it when I was a teacher.
Yeah, well, there's not a whole lot left, I think, following these two dynamic humans. I think one thought that comes to my mind as a practitioner, and I think Jacques well framed our love for the California community college system, and I think it's well earned, most certainly. And I know later in our presentation you're going to go into some of the topical areas that are addressed in the book, so I won't get too far into that rabbit hole. But I think fair to say that at the nexus of the pandemic and what I think is now rightly known as that period of racial reckoning in the spring of 2020 and summer of 2020, what I observed starting to happen in the community colleges within California was just a floodgate opening around learning and growing within the context of increasing our understanding around the inequitable experiences, particularly through a racial lens, of many of our students who are served by the community college system across the state. And that period of sort of just operating in collective shock, I think there was a general sense of a wanting to do the right thing, to know more, to understand what we lacked. And in retrospect, these conversations are happening a lot with my peers. What we lacked at that time was a map for getting back to your Dora reference. Dora, the Explorer. I can't help myself. The parents among us will know what I just did there. Was a map for how to engage those conversations. So what we were getting in that learning and growth was the what was going on, some real talk, but how to engage with one another and through difference, and a willingness to learn to lean into difficult conversations rather than pull back when we're uncomfortable. Feel like that's the power that is packed into this book, is that it offers a bit more framework for the how. And that's magical as a practitioner, sort of having this very recent experience of getting a lot of new learning around equity in higher education and inequity in higher education, but not having a clear sense of how to lean into those conversations. So that would be my one little bit of addition to Tammy and Jacques' comments, is the practical nature of the book for practitioners.
I think the challenge here, I feel like the gumbo metaphor is so overused. I'm tempted not to use it, but I can't help it because I'm hungry. That I think in the creation of the book, it has a little bit of everything thrown in there. And as I was listening to Tammy, the passion, the pain, and the experience that comes through. I know she lives in Jacksonville. I know she's watching the news on the daily, experiencing these things in everyday life and how that impacts. And as we're writing an academic guide, that passion came through the book and it's present. And I'm glad that it is, because it's a flavor that needs to be there. And I think for myself, if I can reflect a minute on the creation of the book, there was part of me that was like, this is really good. And I agree with everything you're saying, but how do we balance it out so that it's for everybody? And in the end, we did not balance it out. There are some rough edges, and I like that they're there. I think they're important that they're there. And so I think as you read it, and Poppy and I had some of these conversations, perhaps it's from our background or our shared experience, but the desire to create a bit more of a consistent narrative throughout the book, or create kind of a guideline to figure these different issues out. Like the issues themselves in each chapter would not be contained. Can I say that? They would not be contained despite efforts to contain them. And I think the book's better for it. So for those of you who lean towards organization, and it's certainly there, it's not a chaotic book, but there are times where I think the passion and the feeling of the authors comes through. And I think that's important. I do think having that balance of understanding, even before you're engaging, a lot of this is about setting the table, or the preparation beforehand, before the meal. Before the conversation. So I think about the orientation leader asked to guide a discussion on the nature of politics, or an RA or a professor in a course, that I think there has to be a preparation that you go through before jumping into that. And I think the book does an excellent job topically of doing that, providing you examples, reflective exercises, questions in all of these different areas. We'll talk about these next. And again, I reflect on Jacques' comments, and having worked with him so closely, I've been, I'm going to go with gobsmacked, awestruck by his ability to also have lived such a powerful and painful experience in the things that he shared with me, but his willingness to interject these things that will pop up on the recording that you'll see, the no shaming, the no forced change, these issues that have been so, though, demanded agreement. When, if there, in my opinion, Jacques, I don't know if I've told you this as directly, if anyone deserved to shame, force change, and demand agreement based on the things that you've experienced, you'd be that person. Yet the way you jump into the conversation is amazing to me, that willingness to engage. And Poppy, to not leave you out, which I never could do, your thoughtfulness and your past experience, your desire, primarily for me, at least from my perspective, of intersectionality, of how do we come together, how do we bring some disparate, some maybe not all exact in alignment pieces into some type of order and progress moving forward from a systems space. And that is very important within, I think, the California community college system and generally in other systems. So I feel like throughout the program, you'll get introspections from therapist Brian on the creation process and how we approach these things. But in the totality of the programs, I think what we're creating here is a bit of a course. This is the intro course, like welcome to class, like welcome back from the summer. This is the beginning, our introduction, so that we can move you through the individual modules. And I think at the end of this, my hope is, I'll let you each tell you what your own hopes are for them, but for the participants, my hope is to really have something helps elevate people's knowledge in the space. I keep using this metaphor. It's not my favorite, but like identifying the minefields, identifying the hot spots of the conversation so that you can be better prepared when you jump into these conversations. I think that's the thought that I have here. Not that we're going to solve this or that you skirt the issue, but as someone who's presented nationally for quite some time, the ability to identify something up front to an audience, even in alcohol and drug class. I used to teach for college students, all of the ones who would get in trouble drinking and doing these things. And I learned over the years to always start the class with, if you choose to drink, here's what we want to talk about: biphasic curve and how to drink responsibly, all of these things. But I learned over the years that there were 2 or 3 people in the class who didn't want to drink or to no longer drink. And by being inclusive with that language from the beginning, people received my talk, my information better. And when I think about these books and the ones I've read in the past, like Taking Sides and these different series, a big part of it was, if we can have a better understanding before we jump into these conversations about what our purpose is, where we're going, how we, what are some of the things that are going to come up so we're not surprised, we can be better prepared to guide folks through that.
Yeah, I would just like to add, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think that it is a guide to help people civilly have conversations and to be able to look at it from other people's perspective, and that perspective taking and understanding that everyone has not had the same experiences. And how do we go about having these conversations where it's not destructive, right? Or where people don't shut down, because oftentimes it's like, well, if I don't agree with you, then I just shut down. And that's not productive at all. And so we want to be progressive, and we want to be able to engage in the conversations and be respectful of people who have different ideologies and different experiences, but still be able to engage. And I think that this book definitely sets you up to understand different perspectives and to have the talking points and have enough knowledge to be able to back up what you're saying, to be able to say, well, have you thought about it this way? Well, what about your situation? And I think, to me, that's very helpful when you're engaging with someone who maybe politically has very different ideologies than you, or has had a very different lived experiences, and they're very much coming from a place of grandeur, and you're not. And it's kind of like, well, have you thought about this? And to give them data. As a social scientist, I like qualitative, but I also like the statistical data. So when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, well, why does that matter? Well, 1 out of 3 African American men will be under the control of the criminal justice system. So let us tell you about the prison industrial complex and how this was set, and just getting people to understand, like Jacques was talking about, those units of socialization. The media, I tell people all the time, as a person brought up in a predominantly European American space who is actually married to an African American, if I base my assumptions of African Americans off of the media, I would think they were all criminals. And if, in recognizing the continued hyper segregation of our society, if I look at political parties, I would have certain ideologies, or the LGBTQI community, or gender, and all these things. So I just think it's like the perfect tool to give you a toolkit to engage in constructive conversations that won't discredit others and won't get people so upset where they shut down. So I think you can definitely have those critical conversations constructively, using this as a tool to help.
Hey, Brian, can I say something just about the energy of the product? When it's reflective of the energy of this team that you have beautifully put together. Uh, it is so important when you do this work to operate in cultural humility. Cultural humility, the simple way to define it is, I don't know what I don't know, and I'm open to learn. And again, I'm so grateful to you for bringing me in community with these amazing folks who are subject matter experts from here to around the world and back. And yet each of us, each of you, my experience of each of you is that you've never stopped being a student. Yes, Poppy is awesome. Brian, you're awesome. Tammy is awesome. You know, the TED Talks. And while you are subject matter experts, you've never stopped being students. And that energy and that way of being is so critically important because that's the definition of empathy, compassion, understanding, really placing yourself in the position of. And Brian, each of us, because I know the lived experience of all of us, and I believe the way we show up with this maximum empathy is because of our own lived experience, where we've been intentionally excluded and marginalized and all the things. And I'm just reminded of that line by Dr. Maya Angelou, and still we rise. You know, there are lots of ways we could have responded, but how we chose to respond in love. We chose to respond in empathy and compassion. We chose to respond with engagement. And that's the beautiful thing, at least my experience of how each of us respond whenever there are these instances where you may want to draw back, where you may want to circle the wagons, or any of those analogies that you want to use. And that's the model, certainly in the education space, that educational institutions should be following, rather than quarreling because, you know, we're risk averse and we don't like conflict. We should recognize conflict, that this is an opportunity to grow. This is an opportunity to be better, to be more effective humans. You know, in the 20th century, we had that the lines that we told ourselves, oh, we're good people. I'm a good people. And even, you know, we remember a comment by the former president of the United States at that incident in Charlottesville saying, they're good people on both sides. You know, for me, the invitation is, it's not, am I a good person? It's, am I an effective person? Am I an effective person at exhibiting all the beauty of humanity? Recognizing that humanity, like democracy, it's imperfect, and we are in the process of creating a more perfect union in the space of democracy, right? And so for us, this is an opportunity where we get to be better. And so rather than attack my academic colleague, whether it's an academic senate or college council or anything like that, I'm going to recognize that even though we may not see eye to eye, I'm going to never dehumanize you. I'm never going to demean you to the sense that I'm denying your humanity, because that's a very dangerous. And we, you know, as students of history, we've seen where other folks have been dehumanized because they didn't think consistent with the dominant culture, and they suffered harmful repercussions because of that. I think we've learned that it doesn't serve us when we dehumanize, and the extent of that canceling culture that you were talking about is when we marginalize and when we completely erase folks. I don't even, and again, this is me and me personally, I know that the former president of the United States is going through a whole host of things. I believe many that he has brought on himself. I'm never going to dehumanize him, because he is worthy of humanity, just like each of us is worthy of humanity. And I think that this book gives us a wonderful vehicle that we get to show how do we can disagree with humans, and we can absolutely support their humanity. And we recognize that we all have different perspectives and lived experiences. I know Tammy says this a lot in her trainings, that we get to recognize that we all have varying degrees of privilege, that we all have varying degrees, that no two lived experiences are the same. And that's really important, because in this, on this planet, we are going to be working with, connected with other humans. And wherever you have two or more humans, you have potential for conflict and for the things to go awry, but that we get to develop tools that get to keep us connected, and don't, just because there is a conflict doesn't mean that I'm going to take my toys, I'm going to go home, and I'm never going to engage with folks again. That's just not practical. And the more we teach students how to do it effectively, number one, we get to be reminded as adults how to do it effectively, right? Because that's what engagement is about. But that just, I think that just makes us, I think it makes us more human. if that's a word,
Yeah,
if that's a concept.
Jacques, it returns me to the language question that I thought was such a good one. A couple quick thoughts. As Tammy came on, she mentioned the word civility, and it triggered for me a moment where I had this East-West Coast experience. That I had this experience on one of the coasts where the word civility had fallen out of grace a bit, and they were preferring respect for each other. And I'm not sure why civility became a problem. I can certainly research that and see if that's a growing area or perhaps just something that might be a point of tension. Latinx, I think, has some similar challenges. Some folks very much connect to that phrase, others find it reductionistic. And flip of it was I was doing a presentation on one of the other coasts, and I used the term microaggressions, and I had some faculty say to me, well, we really find that term offensive. Could we use harmful language? And I'm like, I'm the liberal in the room. You don't get to be more liberal than me. So there's these moments where language can become triggering for folks. And Jacques, as I was listening to you, it's in the recovery, right? Like the language and the triggering, these in the psychology space, these what we call activating events are important. But the belief, the B, right? the B we attach to our activating events, the belief we have about it, this person's disrespectful, this person doesn't care about me, this person has this ideology, leads to a C, a negative consequence. And the whole secret to the, I'm quoting, I think Ellis or Glasser here in the psych space, but the ABC model is really all about identifying things that trigger us, looking at what our belief or indoctrination point is about that, and is that leading us to a positive or a negative consequence? And the other point I'll make real quick was just the balance that I think between the passion that we have for the topic and the delivery to do that in a way that we're hitting well. And Jacques, I know you well enough to know you won't mind me mentioning this, but as you were talking, you said kind of circle the wagons as a metaphor, which has fallen out of grace, right? This has like an indigenous people thing, it's cowboys and Indians. But as I was watching you say it, I'm taking it in. It's because of your passion and the speed at which you're moving and thinking and integrating. And I find myself in that space hundreds of times where I say or do something that might hit someone the wrong way. And it's not about being perfect. And I think this goes to your humans being comment. It's not about being perfect. It's about the recovery piece afterwards to say, oh, well, I didn't mean it that way, but that's how it might have hit people. And how do we bounce back from that? So whether people like it or not, it's going to be really hard for me to avoid throughout the series identifying things that we're doing between the four of us that probably are shadows of what is happening in the country, with the idea that we're trying to be vulnerable to help you learn how to maybe recover from some of these pieces as well. And Jacques, since I called you out on that, I guess I'm going to pass to you for a moment, let you respond.
Oh,
And
so here's the way you handle feedback like that. It's two words, and it is thank you. That's so easy because again, we are all learning and growing. And so I'm glad I completely teed this up beautifully, or you did. But again, we're all learning and growing. Yes, we're experts, but we're never going to stop being students. And that's what we get to center ourselves on. I'm always learning and growing. This is always an opportunity to learn and grow. When I get feedback, I'm not defensive. It's just like the term microaggressions. And again, a lot of the work that we're doing with implicit bias, and there's a wonderful book now, Subtle Acts of Exclusion, and we are leaning into that book more. And it suggests, the authors suggest, rather than using the term microaggressions, because for those of us who have been recipient or targets of the harm inflicted from bias, there's nothing micro about it, right? I mean, the impact can be harmful and hurtful. And so, again, in that vein, when folks give you feedback, say thank you. You don't explain away and like, oh, I didn't mean it that because, one of my best friends is indigenous, or one of my best friends is Black or gay or any. Just take the feedback. We are all learning and growing. We acknowledge that if my words were harmful and if they had an unintended consequence, then let me acknowledge that, because I would never want to harm anyone. And so in that it's a generous spirit, right, Brian? Right, Poppy? I mean, that's what creates this human generosity, that really leads into this empathy and compassion and understanding. And that's something that the Academy should always stand for and proudly represent.
I'm amazed you got to those 2 words. I think most of us get another 2 words in our mind, but we're called out like that, Shock, and I mean, there's probably a learning
But
lesson
I
there.
do want to kind of piggyback on what Jock said in regards to feedback truly is a gift, and some people can't handle it. And to me, that's where fragility comes in. And
Mm,
I do see, and that leads to the Black Lives Matter chapter, right? This white fragility that I see in our society. It's amazing to me, like the sense of entitlement that continues to take place, and just the fragility when we begin to speak about the social construct of race. And people will say, well, I'm Italian, or I'm this, or I'm that, and it's like, but you've been absorbed into that construct of whiteness,
mhm,
and so you have that privilege. And like within the Black Lives Matter chapter, you say Black Lives Matter, then all of a sudden we hear people say, well, all lives matter. Well, then explain to me why the infant mortality rate for African American children is in America is comparable to third world nations. Explain to me why African American women are 4 times more likely to die during childbirth. Explain to me why 1 in 3 African American men will be under the control of the criminal justice system, or explain, I'm in Jacksonville, Florida. We're number 1 in the entire state for referring African American boys and girls to law enforcement for disciplinary reasons. So it's just like people are like, well, all lives matter. And I've heard conversations about, then we heard blue lives matter. Well, let's talk about blue lives matter and then beating the Capitol Police over the head with those flags during the insurrection. So I just really struggle with that. And it's not to say that we're taking away from anyone else. We recognize that lives matter, but how about we focus on those who continue to be marginalized and subjugated and just are really struggling in America? It's not taking away from anyone else, but I think the issue is that we're so individualistic, and it has to be about me, but everything doesn't have to be about you. Again, I'm in Florida where they've rewritten history, and the whole story of Rosa Parks has no mention of race. That was the whole reason she didn't get up. I mean, just and so we've taken that away. And now in our textbooks, starting I think in 7th grade, they're saying that slavery was a good thing because it taught Africans a skill. And that's not true, because again, we built the pyramids, we knew astronomy, we mathematics, all these things. It's like really the slaves were brought over, and Africans were brought over and enslaved. And we're not, as Jock indicated, I mean, it's difficult for us to go back on that side of our history and even find out where we're from, what tribe our ancestors are from. Typically, in the African American community, we can only go back so far because we weren't even counted as people. And so I just think Black Lives Matters is really an important conversation. Especially, like I said, I'm coming from Jacksonville. So in Jacksonville, Jordan Davis was killed by a European American man who thought it was his job to police him in regards to loud music. I'm up the street from where George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin because he thought it was his job to police him. I'm down the street from where the modern day lynching of Ahmaud Arbery happened, where the men thought it was their job to watch him because he looked suspect because he was running and exercising. So again, I think just having the conversations and getting people to understand why we're saying Black Lives Matter is because we continue to see disparities. We're not saying that other lives don't matter, but you're not having these egregious things happen to you or to your family members or someone you know. We saw Sandra Bland. I mean, we could just go on and on, Michael Brown. And it's just not even, like I said, it's not even just the police officers, it's everyday civilians who think it's their job to police Black bodies, or the hypersexualization of the African American woman's body. So there are just so many things to dissect when you talk about Black Lives Matter. I mean, I could just go on forever, but I just really think it's an important chapter. It explains a lot of things because, like I said, one of the big comebacks I get is, what about Black on Black crime? Crime is intraracial, is geographically based, and people of one ethnicity tend to kill other people of that same ethnicity. But we just have these buzzwords, right? And I'm in Florida, so critical race theory is all of a sudden this really bad word. And I'm a critical race theorist. That's the paradigm I use for my dissertation. And it is not a really bad word. It's recognizing that Africans and African Americans have had very different experiences, came from legal studies, recognizing the slow implementation of the Civil Rights Act in regards to desegregating schools and things of that nature, and just how some words have been used to polarize communities. So again, I mean, the Black Lives Matter chapter to me is amazing and just talks about all those different variables and those aspects to get people to understand why there is this movement, which, as you or Poppy indicated, 2020, we had a racial reckoning. It was like the perfect storm because we were all sheltered in place with the pandemic. Then we all saw the murder of George Floyd on television. And I think that's when our allies really, really got that, oh my God, like they're not exaggerating that this is happening in their community because everyone got to see that 9 minutes. So I think it's a very important chapter. I think the entire book, though, everything in there is just something that can be used. And I love the exercises at the end. I'll go ahead and pass it over to Poppy.
Oh, Tammy, thank you so much. As always, really serving up all the truth.